I'm sure many of you are aware of the PCR tests or the swabs. So um, yeah, like in Canada, when you're traveling, like you're required to I think take I think it's either two or three of those PCR swabs. So um, yeah, and I'm sure there's lots of like questions about whether those like PCR swabs are like whether they actually do anything or they help and or they help with anything. So um, I'm gonna pull up an article right now, which which helps like talk about like the PCR like testing and that maybe and like why it should why maybe it should be scrapped. So I'm gonna pull up an article right now. So this is from True North. It says Canada's PCR testing is a sham, and here's a picture of a woman trying to do a PCR test on someone. So it says even with a jab mandate for air passengers in the U.S., limiting entry at the land border to the fully jabbed, the Canadian government is still demanding costly PCR tests for traveling Canadians returning home. True North's Andrew Lawton was nearly stranded abroad last week after a false positive on a $150 government approved test. And then here, and then there's a video down here. I'm gonna play. It's a video from Andrew Lawton, as I think he has his own shows. So I think here he explains like in the video how like he was in Vienna, Austria, and that like he almost got stranded because of the PCR test that the government of Canada requires Canadians to take to return back. So I'm gonna play the video right now.
Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, Canada's disastrous and costly PCR testing requirement, Aaron O'Toole's cracking the whip on Conservative caucus members, and is climate change the new public health crisis?
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North, Tuesday, November 9th, 2021. It is great to have you aboard the program here. I was gone last week on a vacation. I'm glad to be back, although I very narrowly wasn't back. And this actually is a personal anecdote, but also one that ties in very well with a timely story I wanted to get into, and that is Canada's punitive, distressing, and costly PCR test requirement for people to enter the country, including Canadians who have been traveling abroad, something that, believe it or not, is legal, and want to come back home for reasons that become less and less clear with each passing day. So just the primer on this is that if you leave the country and want to come in, whether you are a Canadian citizen, resident, or whether you are just someone visiting Canada, you've got to go through what is called a molecular test. And for the most part, this is a PCR test, although there are a couple of others that are eligible. Rapid tests will not suffice. So if you do a rapid test, you can't come to Canada. And no matter where you are in the world, you've got to procure one of these and get results back within 72 hours, or you will not be allowed to board a flight to Canada. So my wife and I last week were in Vienna, Austria, and we had purchased these testing kits that were actually just launched a couple of weeks ago by Air Canada and Switch Health. And they're called RT lamp tests. The government takes them. You do them yourself, but you have to be on a video call with some Switch Health employee to make sure that you've shoved the swab up your nose sufficiently and haven't been monkeying around with the QR code or anything like that. Anyway, so we bought a couple of these tests, $150 each, brought them overseas with us so that we wouldn't have to deal with the hassle of trying to hunt down a PCR test in some foreign land and waste half a day of vacation doing it and so on and so forth. So we do this. We're trying to do the right thing, trying to room. We're on the Skype call with the nurse. We're doing this. I shove the swab up, and you have to stick it in this vial, stir it around, and then you stick the vial in this machine and put the batteries in, and the machine will do its business for, I think, like 25, 30 minutes or so, and then it tell you positive or negative. So I'm doing this purely as a formality. And 20 minutes later or so, the machine lights up. The test is done. Positive. So according to the Switch Health RT lamp, I have COVID. Or had, as at least last week when I was doing this. And my wife, hers is still processing. Then 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, whatever it is, hers lights up negative. So the two of us who have been, like sitting beside each other doing the test, we've been inseparable for the trip. We were together every day, all day for the days leading up to the trip. Somehow I've got COVID and she does not, according to the test. Now, felt completely fine. I wasn't worried about actually having COVID. I was worried about testing positive because, well, as much as I enjoyed Vienna and would have liked staying there perhaps for a longer period of time at some point, I didn't want to do it in like some Austrian COVID gulag detention center. I wanted to come home on my terms or stay there on my terms, not end up in Austrian quarantine. So that was my concern with this. So I'm like, this is nonsense. This is awful. So thankfully, Austria is a place that has a lot of access to COVID testing. It's just something the country has made a point of trying to have available for people. My wife was able to pick up a few rapid tests from a pharmacy across the street. I did one rapid test. It was negative. Slept on it. Did another one in the morning. It was negative. At this point, I'm fairly optimistic that I had gotten a false positive on the first test. So I went to procure a lab test, like a proper test. Did that, got the other guy to put the swab up my nose and in the back of my throat, and that was it, thankfully. And that one came back a couple hours later as negative. So I was able to take that test, get on the plane, come home, and that is where I am now, thankfully, back on Canadian soil. So all of this to say, I'm pretty good at rolling with the punches. I'm pretty good at being spontaneous if I need to be. But I could see a lot of people, a lot of travelers that have tried to do everything right, being in a situation here where they're just downright terrified because they think they're going to be stranded in another country, despite not actually being sick. Or you can't access one that can guarantee you results back within 72 hours. So the idea of doing one yourself is pretty appealing to a lot of people. So I can imagine just how terrifying this would be for someone, especially if it's the first time they've traveled internationally in 2 years, which is probable for a lot of people. This was my first time overseas since I was covering some conference in 2019. So that's where we were. But the fascinating thing about this is that I was not sick. I had, even if I had had COVID, managed to go weeks without giving it to my wife and having no symptoms. And the reality is that I was not posing a threat to anyone, but the government's PCR testing requirement almost stranded me abroad. Now, some of you listening may think, yeah, well, that's actually better for Canada if you're stranded abroad, Andrew. It's not just about me. It's about everyone. It's about all of you. This week, the United States finally reopened its land border to Canadians, which means if you are a Canadian, especially one of them who lives in the border community like Windsor, Ontario, Sarnia, Abbotsford, BC, and this is just part of your life, just going back and forth across the border, getting cheap groceries in the U.S., going to American restaurants, you can't come back unless you can prove to the government that you've had one of these molecular tests, even if you just go over for an hour. You go over to the U.S., you have lunch at Olive Garden, you come back home, you've got to have a PCR test or you're going to get fined $5,000. Because the whole point of the test is that it has to be done less than 72 hours before your return if you are arriving by land or when you board the flight if you're coming in by air. Less than 72 hours. If you're going to the US and coming back in an afternoon, say, you can use a test that you got in Canada 3 days before you left. I could get a test at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday, go to the US at 9 a.m. on a Friday, come back at noon on a Friday, and show that test that I got in Canada 3 days prior, and that will admit me into the country. Now, if I do this, even if I magically picked up COVID in the United States on that Friday and the couple of hours there, this test is not detecting it. So the testing has nothing to do with the actual travel risk. The original testing requirement was to make sure that if you were coming from Wuhan and you had been in Wuhan for 6 weeks, you weren't bringing in some new strain. What are we up to? The Kappa Alpha Theta variant or whatever. So that was the point of it. It wasn't meant to be, if you're going away for just a couple of days, for a couple of hours, that this test would pick it up magically and be the deal breaker in you getting home. That was never meant to be the point of it. So even if you accept at face value that these tests are effective, that these tests work, they aren't working for the stated purpose. But as my case demonstrates, these tests are not, as numerous people have been warning for 2 years now, as much of a silver bullet in detection as so many of their proponents like to be. I got a false positive. I think it's highly unlikely it could have been a genuine positive because of how soon after I got the negatives and the subsequent negative and the subsequent negative after that. So it was a false positive. False positives are a genuine risk. Even the instruction manuals that come with these tests show that false positives are a risk. They say they're rare, of course. But this is a very high-stakes game for Canadians who want to travel abroad when it is not producing any public health benefit. And in my case, look, these tests that we brought away were $150 each. The test I had to get in Austria to get myself back in, the one that came back negative, was 89 euros, which was actually a fairly inexpensive test in some parts, even in the US. Some of these tests, the ones that will guarantee you results within a certain time frame, cost $250 American. So you take a family of 4 over to Bellingham, Washington, or Port Huron, Michigan, to come back $1,000 US. Most families cannot afford that. So as always, these restrictions that we see governments impose only seem to target one specific demographic. When the land border closed, the rich could ship their cars over and take a helicopter. The rich could always fly into the U.S., fly back. The rich could afford these homes in which they could quarantine. It's the lower income people that have no recourse against these punitive measures that even today are being punished and prevented from traveling, even though the reopening has happened, because they can't afford this testing requirement. And the government's plan with this, if it wasn't abundantly clear, is not to prevent the importation of COVID. It's to reduce travel. It's to reduce mobility. They want to make it so costly and so cumbersome to travel that most people can't do it or think it's not worth the hassle and will decide not to. But the government can claim, oh, you have a right to. Sure, you're allowed to. But they've taken it away. It really isn't a legitimate choice, in the same way that a vaccine mandate to travel by air is not a legitimate choice because you're being forced to if you want to partake in the certain benefits, or what are supposed to be benefits, of living in a free society. Now, I'm not alone in this, by the way. Most people are saying this testing requirement does not need to exist. Leaders in American border communities have been saying for quite some time. American business owners have been saying for quite some time. They think this testing requirement is very punitive. It does not help public health. And more importantly, it hurts these border communities that have been longing for the reopening that is supposed to be taking place this week. But even the public health experts, on whom the government says it relies to make determinations about public policy, are saying this is absolutely not required. Now, all the federal government is saying is that they'll continue to evaluate the measures and make necessary adjustments as required. That's what a spokesperson for the new health minister, Jean-Yves Duclos, has said to Global News, which is basically the answer that they give to anything now, so that they don't end up stepping in it like when Patty Hajdu was calling border closures racist like 3 minutes before they closed the border. They don't want to say anything decisively, so it's just, well, we continue to monitor and look, and we're exploring and all that jazz. But let's look at what the actual public health experts are saying here. Dr. Amesh Adalja, who is a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, says, wouldn't it make more sense to have a rapid test done at the border? You can get one in 15 minutes or even faster rather than a 72-hour-old PCR test that's sometimes logistically difficult and expensive to get. Fatima Kakar, who's a pediatric infectious disease specialist in Montreal, says, yeah, the PCR is the gold standard, but if we're talking about a population that's overwhelmingly vaccinated, is it okay to take the risk of just using rapid tests? And she says, yeah, it's completely reasonable to ask that question. Dr. Zain Chagla, an infectious disease physician at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton, says the antigen test should be considered. He said if we're trying to prevent people from entering Canada with active COVID, a rapid test is probably even more accurate than a 72-hour-old PCR test because you're catching people that are infectious at the moment that they enter Canada. And the key with that is that if you land and test positive with a rapid test, you have not been at least denied entry to your country. If I had been, let's say I had been stranded in Austria. I know Scott Hayward pointed out on Twitter the other day that, there are far worse fates imaginable, which I accept. But nevertheless, if I had been stranded in Austria, what the Canadian government is basically doing is telling Austria that, you know what, they're your problem. We don't want to deal with Canadians that might have COVID. They're your problem. And if I couldn't afford to get another test, if I were somewhere where I couldn't have access to another test, I would have been denied the right to enter my own country for no reason whatsoever. And this is coming at a time when the vast majority of international travelers are fully vaccinated, which the government says is the target, is the priority. It's coming, well, if you want to board a plane in Canada, you have to be vaccinated. You have to be fully vaccinated if you want to fly somewhere in Canada. So within the next few weeks, the only people traveling will effectively be fully vaccinated individuals. People that have done what the government said was essential to reopening. People who have done their part. They did what the government asked them to do to flatten the curve, to stop the spread, to plank the curve, to get to COVID zero, whatever the platitudes are that are forming our goal. People who have done that. And now the government is saying, well, you know what? You're not that safe after all. You're not actually as safe as we told you would be if you were vaccinated. So what we're living in right now is a reopening that isn't a reopening at all. A reopening that comes with all of these terms and conditions that effectively hamper your ability as a Canadian to partake in what is supposed to be this momentous occasion, the triumphant vanquishing of COVID, the border reopening, international travel restrictions being dropped, and so on. And now you are still forced to pay the price because the Canadian government does not know what it's doing. We've got to take a quick break. When we come back, more of the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. Stay tuned.
You're tuned in.
Welcome back.
Okay, so that's the end of that video, and yes, I can close on now. So yeah, I only want to play the beginning of that video because he was talking about the government of the government's like PCR test and all that. So yeah, Andrew Lawton, he talks about in that earlier segment about how he was nearly stranded in Austria because of the government's PCR test requirement to return back to Canada. So yeah, he basically said how even though he was with his wife the whole time, somehow somehow he ended up testing positive for COVID, but his wife didn't. So yeah, and then he also talks about he also mentioned how about how these COVID tests and all that, they're not about all it does is just discourage people from traveling, as they now have to pay, especially people who aren't wealthy, as they have to pay somewhere between between $100 or $200 just for like those PCR tests. So yeah, and then he also said how it's also like a violation of mobility rights, which is like Section 6 of the Charter. So like it's all like illegal what they're doing, and also like the government of Canada is also saying like how you won't like how you like if you're a Canadian citizen you won't be able to travel unless you've been fully jabbed, which I think that's also like illegal as well. So yeah. Also, there's something I wanted to show. There's also an article I want to pull up, another article I want to pull up as well, which is about the PCR test and all that. So I'm gonna pull it up right now because there's lots of like doubts about these PCR tests and whether they're reliable and all that. So I'm gonna share an article right now. Okay, so this is an article from Portugal Resident. It says so this so this is about like a court case in Portugal that said the PCR tests and all that they're like how it's like unreliable and also that's unconstitutional as well. So I'm gonna read it. It says judges in Portugal highlight more than debatable reliability of COVID tests. With the country assailed daily by news of rising case numbers, judges in Lisbon have described the reliability of tests being rolled out in their tens of thousands as more than debatable. Indeed, they cite a study that suggests only 3% of positive tests declared by health authorities may be true positives. A 34-page ruling on an appeal against a writ of habeas corpus filed by 4 German tourists illegally confined to a hotel in the Azores over the summer leaves no doubt that a positive RT-PCR test cannot be taken on face value. Few media sources have Few media sources, however, have touched on this aspect of the Lisbon appeal court ruling, and those that have given it the scantest of mentions. The judge's deliberations, nonetheless, are loud and clear, set out over 3 pages. The panel looked into the reliability of RT-PCR tests due to the enforced confinement of the holidaymakers in question because one had tested positive. Said the ruling, dated November 11th, and in view of current scientific evidence, this test shows itself to be unable to determine what, beyond reasonable doubt, that such positivity corresponds, in fact, to the infection of a person by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. RT-PCR tests, standing for polymerase chain reaction tests, are performed by amplifying samples through repetitive cycles. The number of cycles of such amplification results in a greater or lesser reliability of such tests, and the problem is that this reliability shows itself in terms of scientific evidence as more than debatable. It's here. The ruling cites a study conducted by some of the leading European and world specialists in the material published by the Oxford Academic at the end of September. Uh, at a cycle threshold of 25, about 70% of samples remain positive in cell culture, i.e., were infected in a CT of 30. 20% of samples remain positive. In a cycle threshold of 35, 3% of samples remain positive, and in a cycle threshold above 35, no sample remain positive in the culture. This means that if a person has a positive PCR test at a threshold of cycles of 35 or higher, as happen as happens in most laboratories in the USA and Europe, the chances of a person being infected is less than 3%. The probability of a person receiving a false positive is 97% or higher. The judges stress that they were unable to find any recommendations of rulings on the number of amplifications used in tests carried out by Portuguese health authorities, but they went on to cite a second study published in The Lancet that suggests any diagnostic test should be interpreted in the context of the effective possibility of the disease existing before the test is actually carried out. This is not what happens in Portugal, which logs thousands of asymptomatic cases every day, obliging them all to go into quarantine. The bottom line is that these asymptomatic positives may not be positives at all. But while Lisbon's appeal court appears to have accepted doubts raised by experts over the reliability of RT-PCR tests, DGS health authorities continue to use them, and the government and media continue to trumpet them as reasons for maintaining the current state of emergency, which the country heard tonight may well continue beyond December 8th. And it says, okay, then I think there's a link to see the judge's ruling in full. Click here, and so I'm not going to click on that. So, yeah, that's the end of the article. So you can close that now. So yeah, that article was from a year ago, I think. So that was an article about like the courts in Portugal, saying like how these PCR tests, like like they're they're not, they don't actually help in detecting the disease, and that they're actually like the tests, they're run at cycles of 35 or more, meaning that the chances of a false positive is higher. So yeah, and so yeah, and also means that the chances of a false positive is higher, like at 97% or more, I think. So, but like apparently in Canada, like this, like it's still being used, these PCR tests. So, and the video I showed earlier, with Andrew Lawton, like he said, it nearly like he nearly wasn't he almost wasn't allowed to return back to Canada because of that like PCR test. So yeah, so yeah, that's yeah, like the whole like all these tests, like PCR, rapid tests, whatever they're called, like they're all like they're it's all like illegal too, like unconstitutional as well. So as you know, you're having like a medical procedure done like against your will, and if it's not done like properly, then you might end up with some type of issues, like brain damage, because when someone like puts that in your nose, they may push it too far, they may stick it too far into your nose, which could give you some type of problems. So yeah, like that's like the problem with these tests. But in Canada, like apparently, or like the government in Canada, they're like trying to make everyone like people who want to travel, they're trying to force everyone to do like these PCR tests. Otherwise, they won't be allowed to like travel or even like return home from abroad. So yeah, like it's all like yeah, so like it's all like illegal, and examples like that article I showed about Portugal, like their court ruling that it's illegal, like that's just an example of how like these tests, like there's no like they don't help with anything, and that all it is just to yeah, just to like I guess prevent people from traveling if they want to travel. So and like yeah, and if if they're not careful in how they stick that in their nose, then they might end up with some type of problem. So oh, and like also those swabs, they have like EO in it, which it stands for ethylene oxide, which is like cancer like substance or substance that causes cancer. So like people are constantly having those like put into their nose. So as a result, they're like exposed to like EO, because the way like people get exposed to that is if they inhale it or ingest it. So putting that swab of like sprayed with EO into the nose is one way like people get exposed to EO. So yeah, that's another problem with these tests. So yeah, that's everything. So yeah, like that's everything I want to talk about, and I'll be signing off now.